Hello everyone, this is Bob and Threadbare, and welcome back to Threadbare Reviews. Today's subject is the request of patron Shaykun, who wanted me to track down something a little unusual. It's an OVA, which stands for Original Video Animation, which is titled Zone of Enders 2167 Idolo. Quite a mouthful, that. It's an hour-long anime production that came out in 2001 as a tie-in to a video game. And since that's going to take some explaining, let's get into it. The story about the story. In March of 2001, the video game director Hideo Kojima, who was still working with Konami at the time, created a mecha action game called Zone of the Enders, or sometimes just Zone of Enders. It was an early title for the PlayStation 2, which had come out just a year earlier, and incidentally, Kojima would release Metal Gear Solid 2 later that year. The game takes a relatively more realistic approach to mecha anime, and since the goal of the game is to protect a Jovian colony, it also penalizes you based on the amount of destruction and civilian deaths you let happen. Then the ending changes based on how successful you were defending the colony. The game got a generally positive response thanks to good controls and interesting map designs, but the plot was weak and the English translation was hilariously bad. It's also widely suspected that a lot of people bought the game not for itself, but for the Metal Gear Solid 2 demo that came with the original disc. Still, it did well enough to spawn a small franchise, and got itself an HD re-release when the PS3 came out. But we're not looking at the game today, no. You see, something Japanese media companies love to do is multimedia releases. There's one product that's the flagship, which can be an anime, a manga, light novel, or a video game, and then there's a bunch of tie-in media that hooks people who prefer other media and hopefully draws them to the flagship product. In this case, the tie-in is a 1-hour OVA that takes place 5 years before the first video game and explains the origin of orbital frames, the super mechas that the protagonist and the villains all pilot. The OVA came out on the same day as the video game, and while I can't find anything that says so, I suspect that at least in some cases the two were packaged together. But if you're interested enough, you can buy Zone of Enders Idolo on its own these days, and since it's a prequel, you don't have to play any of the games to understand what's going on. I know I haven't. And with that in mind, let's move on to the next segment. The review. In the year 2167, Mars is terraformed, inhabited, and under the heel of Earthlings. Our protagonist is Radium Levans, a mech pilot who gets transferred along with his friend Viola to a secret project. The Martian military is developing a new kind of mech called an orbital frame that uses a new metal called Metatron, and the hope is that these new weapons will help Mars win its independence. Radium is the main pilot of the prototype, Idolo, and while he needs some time to get used to controlling it, he and the mech eventually unify, and even synchronize brainwaves. This causes Idolo to reject other pilots, and it amplifies Radium's anger and hatred even when he's not in the mech. Eventually, Earth forces discover the project and attack the base to kidnap both the chief scientist and Radium's girlfriend, Dolores. So Radium goes rogue to chase after them before they can leave Mars's orbit, but then Dolores dies and Idolo goes on a rampage. Radium and Idolo are shot to pieces in the ensuing battle, and Viola goes on to be one of the main antagonists in the video game. The thing that stuck out to me the most about this movie is the pacing. It has only 55 minutes to tell a complete story, and to do so, it trims all the round edges off of the scenes and cuts down all of the dialogue to the bare essentials. It does tell a complete story, and it does take a moment or two to let the characters breathe, but it is startling how quickly a scene will end and then jump into the next thing. Perhaps as another result of this time crunch, the plot of the movie is very straightforward and predictable. They just didn't have any time to spare on red herrings or side plots. You see Radium going crazy in little ways early on, and then he goes crazy in a big way at the end. Radium says he needs Dolores and will quit the army to be with her, and immediately before he can, she gets kidnapped and then killed. Earth people are one-dimensional villains, the commander is gruff and no-nonsense like every other military commander in fiction, the scientist resigns because the project is too dangerous. Everything about this movie has been done before. The animation quality is about average for an early 2000s anime. It's grainy but colorful, and it uses a lot of cheats to keep the animation costs down. And while you do get a good sense of scale during the combat scenes, everything has a tendency to explode into easily animated fireballs. As for the English vocal cast, there weren't any standout performances, but they got the job done. I will say that the music was pretty good though, and it really helped amplify the mood, especially in the more emotional scenes. So, would I recommend watching ZOE Idolo? Well, not so much. There are a lot of other military movies and mecha anime that do the same thing Idolo does, but do it better. Still, it's only an hour long, and it doesn't do anything wrong, it's just aggressively average. So if you happen across it, give it a watch. But otherwise, I don't think it's worth seeking out. The analysis. As I've said before, even if a work is uninspired, it still has something to say, and only a work that is supremely incompetent will be impossible to understand. So while Idolo has nothing new to say, it does still have something. For one thing, Idolo points out that being the underdog and being oppressed does not necessarily make someone more righteous or heroic. Radium is bullied by Earthlings regularly, but once he has the power to defy them, he becomes sadistic and murderous. His anger is justified, certainly, but that justification doesn't make him a better person. And so Radium becomes unsympathetic when he starts reveling in the violence, and only becomes sympathetic again when he goes out to rescue his girlfriend from the Earth forces. Another thing that the movie says is that the cycle of violence and oppression is unending. Mars was originally an independent planet, but at some point Earth forces came over to occupy Mars, and they exploited the population. A revolution is inevitable, and either Earth will win and continue the oppression, or Mars will win and probably send out some of its own colonies to later oppress. Violence is in our blood, and the best thing we can do is acknowledge that violence and try to keep it in check. Because if we try to pretend that we're not violent, that violent thoughts don't apply to us, then it's much more likely to slip out of its cage. Thanks for joining me again for today's Threadbare review, and I hope I'll see you next time. Until then, please remember to like, share, and subscribe, and if you have a little extra money to spare, you can support me on Patreon. Link in the description.